Hi, this is Andrew Aversa with Impact Soundworks, and today we're going to be looking at part 3 of my tutorial on how to make a metal song using only virtual instruments. We've already covered the general overview and the lead guitars, so if you want to check that out, look in the video description. So today we're going to be looking at the rhythms. So as a reminder, let's check out the beginning of the song. Okay, so first of all, we are using Shreddage 3 Jupiter for the rhythm. This is actually the first Shreddage 2 guitar that we ever did. It was simply called Shreddage 2 Absolute Electric Guitar. A lot of people really like this 7-string because it has these very thick, chunky palm mutes and a very dark tone overall. It lends itself quite well to rhythm playing. Because it was not a Shreddage 3 guitar originally, it only has one pickup position, which is the bridge, but it does sound really nice. If we look at the MIDI data, which by the way is in the video description, you can see we're using a lot of articulation switching via key switches. Now this is actually the default mapping with all of our Shreddage 3 instruments. In the lead guitar video, I showed how you could use velocities, but here we're using key switches. So if we want to switch to mutes, we just press C#-1, or you can click on the keyboard here, and then you can go to staccatos, sustains, power chords, power chord mutes, and power chord staccato. Unlike with lead guitars, we're not really spending a lot of time automating the pitch bends and the vibrato of the rhythm part. Although I'm doing that a little bit, you can see there's a little bit of manual vibrato in a few spots in this whole entire sequence for the entire song. And there's a couple spots where I'm using the mod wheel, but really compared to the lead, it's not very much. Instead, we're going to spend our time looking at a few things. When I use different articulations, the note lengths, and then the velocities. What would this sound like if we didn't do any articulation switching at all? I'm gonna delete this track down here of key switches and let's play the intro. So that might be a sound that you're looking for, but it definitely doesn't sound like how a real guitarist would play a rhythm part, especially in a metal song. They're going to be doing those chugs, which are palm mutes. If we skip ahead to later on, let's hear what that might sound like with all sustains. Come take a drive with me, burning in second gear. Speed is a guarantee. Again, it's very flat because this is just not how a guitarist would play that part. What if instead we used all palm mutes? Like, okay, maybe not all sustains, but what if we're just chugging the entire time? Again, it's the same kind of problem. We're missing a crucial element. And even if you are not used to writing metal parts for rhythm guitar, you can just tell it doesn't sound right. Like we have these notes that are longer, and hearing those as mutes instead of a more open sustain just doesn't sound right. Now, in some parts, it might sound okay. Like if you have a lot of fast repeated notes like here, like that sounds okay. But then if we go to this part, for example, the repeated notes sound good, but these high notes, because the higher you get on the neck and the higher you ascend in pitch, the shorter the muted notes are going to get. What ends up happening is it just lacks some of the accentuation, the punch that you would get by using fully sustained or power chord sustained notes. So let's hear it with the vocals. Come take a drive with me, burning in second gear. Speed is a guarantee. That's what I want to hear. And then even worse would be if we went later in the song where we have these what were power chord sustains. Supersonic driver, demonic rider, atom bomb. So clearly we need to have a mix of sustains and palm mutes at the very least. And how I choose to switch between those is usually by looking at both higher pitches, which are going to be more likely to sound good as sustains, And then if we have notes that I want to accentuate and emphasize in the rhythm. So for example, right in this first riff. Da, 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 da. If we were talking about a different instrument, we might do that emphasis strictly using volume, like playing those notes louder. But because everything is high gain here, we can't just make the notes louder. It doesn't really make sense. It's going through a high gain amp. So that's the first way I would choose to switch between articulations. I didn't do all of this at once, like one note at a time, constantly switching. What I did was I did one pass first, just with all mutes, for example. And then I would start putting in sustains after that. And then you see these notes here, the D sharp one and the E one, these are power chords. So when would we switch between single notes and power chords? What I started with was this, basically no power chords at all. So let's skip ahead just for variation to here and see what this sounds like. This sounds fine. This sounds pretty good to me. However, you'll notice that the right part, measure 25 non, is basically a repeat of 17. So when I was thinking about how do I want to make this repeat of these 8 bars, how do I want this to sound different? How can I vary this up? My thought was, well, I can just switch up how I'm using single notes versus power chords. Go through, and as I listen back, I would just move some of these key switches up to the power chord range. So for example, when we first do this riff, it's mostly single notes, right? When you hear the beginning of it. And there's just one little power chord here for flavor. Little bit of emphasis with the power chord sustain, but mostly single notes. But then listen to the repeat. Here we start off with power chords. Compare that to this part. This is a way of setting the beginning of this riff apart from the first time we did it so it doesn't sound so repetitious. And likewise, when we get to this part here, when you have a really long sustained note, just having it on a single pitch, it kind of depends on what you're writing, but it's usually going to sound a lot thicker and more full if you use a power chord. So in context, let's hear what this would sound like as a single note. So this is the same sustained articulation, but it obviously does not sound nearly as full as if we were to use a power chord where we're getting 3 strings, 3 pitches. And then later on, same thing here, right? Never-ending supersonic driver, napalm survivor. Okay, so to recap, basically we want to use sustains instead of palm mutes when we want to emphasize certain notes, particularly if the notes are longer. If you have a very long note, for example, like a half note or a whole note like we do here, in fact, this one is like almost 2 whole notes long, then you want to think about using a power chord sustain because that's just going to sound more full and more rich. And when it comes to using mutes, the difference between a regular mute and a power chord mute is basically just 2 flavors of the same thing. You don't want to use only power chord mutes because it's going to sound just overwhelming. I mean, actually, it's not bad, but if we did that in the intro, it sounds a little bit better. But here. Highway drive, I'm going insane, dead or alive. See, I think it takes up a little bit too much sonic space in this part. Okay, so that's how to choose between different articulations when you're writing these rhythm parts. There's also the idea of note length and velocity. So let's play this original riff, but instead of having these durations, I'm going to quantize everything. It's pretty good. However, it's a little too clean. Real players are not going to seamlessly hold directly from the end of one note to the next perfectly every time, especially when they're changing frets or strings, right? If I want to add a little bit of that realism and also emphasize the release noise in between notes, shortening some of the notes so that they're not butted right up against the edge of the next note is a good way to do that. And we could emphasize this even more if we wanted to. It really depends on how fluid and flowing you want the part to be. If you want things really choppy, then you would use very short notes, right? The important thing is just don't quantize everything because it will sound mechanical over the course of the song. And this concept is particularly relevant when we're talking about power chords because it's going to be difficult for a real player to switch between power chords 100% instantly. By the way, throughout this whole rhythm part, you'll notice on the F#2, this is the fret noise key, the noise key, and this is a great way to add a little bit of extra realism. Now, this is noise, and in reality, a lot of players try to minimize this. But because we're using a virtual instrument where the individual notes were played very cleanly, then adding some of these squeaks when you change pitches can help enhance the realism. So if we take these out, let's hear what this sounds like. Again, it's not bad, right? But I think having the squeak there when they're changing notes, changing the power chord position, I just think that sounds a little bit more realistic. And you do have to consider where that squeak comes in, right? So there's a gap between these two notes. So if you have it too early, that's not quite gonna work. That doesn't work because the fret slide sound is too early. It's like now there's a microscopic gap where there's nothing happening. And then if we have it really close to the next one, it might sort of bleed into the attack. It's pretty good, but generally speaking, there's just this sweet spot. And the only way you can figure out what that sweet spot is, it depends on what tempo you're writing at. It depends on where the notes are on the grid. And you can just sort of move the squeak around until it sounds just right. I think this one in particular sounds like spot on. And then again here. Once again, with no fret squeaks. Now you know that having the fret squeaks and having the gaps, a little bit of a gap there between notes, just adds that extra bit of realism. One thing I'm doing that is like the lead guitar sequencing is the slide down effect, which just like with lead guitars, sometimes at the end of a long note, you can use a slide down here from G3 to A#2. Often real players don't just lift their hands up and go to the next note, right? They will slide up and down the neck constantly. And we've seen that in performances from real guitarists. So I want you to listen carefully to that slide here. We can even slow down the tempo so you can hear it better. So it's pretty fast, but it adds a little bit of extra lead in to the next note, to the next measure. Now, later in the song, we have this very fast chugging part. And this is a great example of how velocity can make a big difference, especially when you're using Shreddage 3 guitars, because we have up to, depending on the guitar, 5 different layers or levels of palm mutes, where the lowest velocities are extremely muted, and then the higher velocities are more like half muted. If I play a D3, the lowest velocity is so short, it's so muted, there's almost no pitch. And then if I do a higher velocity, that note actually sustains for a while. And then everything in between. We could experiment and see what would this sound like if we didn't have any variation in the velocity. Or higher velocity, right? Or all low velocity. Those aren't bad necessarily because we have so many round robins and we have the up and down stroke samples. But when you vary up the velocity, it adds a little bit more life to it because a real player can't apply the exact same pressure to each and every note 100% perfectly. So that's why I like to just vary it up, right? And we can hear that earlier on as well, where if we look at the beginning pattern, let's say we used all low velocities for this part. Now we're still using sustains and palm mutes, but what if we used all low velocity mutes? And if we did the same here. So again, that might be what you're looking for, but personally, I like to have the variation. Or we could say, what if we used all higher velocity mutes, which are going to be more like half open. That type of sound could be what you're looking for. It's not to say that that's bad, but it's something that you need to consider when you're selecting your mute velocity. And depending on the guitar that you're using, the way somebody performs a heavy palm mute is going to vary between players. So for example, the Jupiter low velocity mutes are going to sound a little bit different than the Serpent ones and the Rogue ones. I actually think this part of the riff is another example of where the differences in velocities really help. So let's listen to these 4 bars. I especially on purpose like these particularly short notes here. Now, what if we made these all short? Even though, for example, this D3 is not sustained, because we have it at a high velocity, it's more accentuated. Whereas if it were this low velocity, it just sort of dies immediately. And that doesn't work quite so well compared to The most important thing is try adjusting those velocities and you'd be surprised at how much extra life you get with your rhythm parts. Lastly, I did say that I used a little bit of pitch manipulation, and that's in a couple spots here. Right, so that's just a little da 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 with the pitch wheel. That could just as easily have been mod wheel. And in fact, I use mod wheel on this F3. Let's see what it sounds like. And I used it back here too. So what if we didn't do that? There's no motion on this note. That sounds a little bit more natural. It's probably more like how a guitarist would play. They like adding articulation and movement to each note. When you're doing a rhythm part and you have these longer notes, consider just adding a little bit of vibrato to the long notes. But of course, you can overdo it, right? Like you don't want to use the same high vibrato on every single longer note you have. It's not going to do anything on the power chords. I should have taken that out. Although, honestly, not too bad. Like, maybe I like that, right? Other things to note. So as far as the patch setup, there's really not a whole lot going on beyond the default settings. We're using a low hand position. Because we're playing low, it really has to be a low hand position, unless it's for like a 9-string guitar where we would have more choice. Because Jupiter is pretty dark, I increased the byte value. You could hear what that would sound like in context if we were to increase that value.
Come take a drive with me, learning in second gear. Speed is
So a little bit of extra bite helps. And then the extra attack, that is the pick attack. So it sounds a little ridiculous when you have it turned all the way up for every note. A guitarist would not play like that. I'm also using anti-repetition on the advanced page. So that's something that you should generally have for rhythm stuff, and everything else is pretty much standard. Now, I already showed off the Shreddage Amp XTC patch that I'm using. This is using the Klon Centaur pedal that we have in the latest version of XTC, along with the Tokyo Cabs Volume 1, providing the impulse response for the speakers. But you don't necessarily have to use XTC. Any amp simulation will do. The thing is that you need to EQ the guitar and you EQ the amp output based on the preset you're using. So for example, let's say we switch this to twin metal. Is this going to sound right when I play it back? No, it is not, clearly. The setup that I have here with the instrument volume, the contact volume going into the amp, and then the EQ after the amp, that's all configured with the previous patch I had. You can't just change the patch and expect everything to perfectly fit in the mix. You would have to then take this, for example, I'm going to take off this EQ and show you how I would approach it if I switched patches. I think this is probably not the right amp preset for this, but it's just to show you that we have to do some serious sculpting in order to make it fit. You can't just cycle through patches and expect it to perfectly fit on your first attempt. Let's go to maybe dual cab heavy. That's with no EQ. And then let's hear this in context with the vocals.
Come take a drive with me, burning in second gear. Speed is a guarantee. That's what I want to hear. Every time I close my eye.
Another thing to keep in mind too is that this is going to change depending on what guitar I'm using. I'm using Jupiter, right? Let's say I instead loaded a different guitar. Here I have Shreddage 3 Hydra loaded up instead of Jupiter. It's got a low hand position. I've restored the original amp patch, the original EQ. Everything else is the same. And now just to A/B it against Jupiter. And then likewise, if we go to the verse, let's hear this. And compare that to Hydra. There's some differences here. Even though everything else is the same and it's a high gain sound, we might need to use a little bit of a different EQ, maybe adjust the amp patch a little bit. If you want to compare all of the Shreddage 3 instruments to date as of the making of this video, I have several comparison videos, which I'm going to put in the video description, that have the exact same rhythm pattern, the exact same chugging pattern, lead pattern compared across all of the guitars with both clean, crunchy, and high gain sounds. I would check out those videos. Anyway, so that's a look at how I approach the rhythm guitars for this metal song production. Again, a lot of these techniques apply no matter what guitar you're using. And in fact, when you look at the mixing and the amp tweaking and the EQ, that stuff applies even if you're recording live guitar. Like if you switch guitars or you switch amp presets or whatever, it's the same thought process for mixing and fitting that into the song. I hope you learned something here. You can download the MIDI and the patches I'm using in the video description, as well as check out the previous parts of this song tutorial. All right, I'll see you in the next one.